Good afternoon. I am Dr. Nsenga Burton from the Department of Film and Media at Emory University, and I'd like to welcome you to the 2021 Faculty Women of Color in the Academy Conference and our workshop on scholar activism and the Academy, using media scholarship and content to create social change. Joining me today are Dr. Beretta Smith-Shomade, who's also in the Department of Film and Media at Emory University, Professor and Filmmaker Dehanza Rogers, who's also in the Department of Film and Media at Emory University, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Tina Harris, who is at the School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University, also known as LSU. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we will be talking about this very important topic. So without further ado, let's get started. So for those of you who are just kind of new to this, which I doubt because most Black women are not, especially Black women in the academy, but just in case there's a small chance. Scholar activists are basically academics who are a bridge between the academy and the communities they serve. That's a quote for Dr. Alvaro Huerta, and it's Alvaro Huerta. Day, you can correct me later. But we have one foot in the academy and the other foot in the communities we serve, and then we study, right? So scholar activists don't often see these factors as mutually exclusive, but sometimes we are seen as mutually exclusive from these factors. So for example, sometimes in our scholarship, particularly if our scholarship focuses on women of African descent or people of African descent or historically disenfranchised populations, the academy doesn't value it in the same way that they value some of the more traditional, or I would call ruling class populations that are studied, and vice versa, because we are connected to the academy, which often has a precarious relationship with our communities, particularly communities of color, those that have been disenfranchised historically, and those who have been really in a very tenuous relationship with universities and colleges throughout the country, particularly the U.S. Is really throughout the world, but I'm talking about the U.S. right now. Often we are met, or can be, I won't say often, but sometimes we can be met with suspicion. And so, you have one foot in one place, one foot in the other place. So we have to kind of navigate that kind of space. So we are in what I would call a precarious situation. Our goal is to help the community. Our goal is to use what we have in the classrooms, in these academic institutions, and use it for the benefit of the community. But we also have to secure and advance our academic career and our future. And so sometimes there is a contradiction in those two things. But it doesn't mean that we stop. There are different types of scholar activism. There are many types. I just picked out physical and mental activism because I think people can relate to that pretty quickly. Physical is like when you're actually in person, touching, feeling. I mean, of course, that's different in COVID, but actively in person. Maybe you're engaging in a protest. Maybe you've taken over a building or you've been part of that kind of activity. Mental activism is what I call what we do. Particularly what I do. And I do some of the other stuff too. But in terms of my scholarship, in terms of my professional life, the mental activism is really applying your intellectual expertise, your access to resources, access to these dominant institutions, and using it for the benefit of the community. So knowledge production and dissemination are integral mechanisms of social change. So some people argue about that. You might have heard when people say, oh, using Twitter is not a way of making social change. Well, it can be, if you look at Oscar So Black or Oscar So White, which started, and then you got Oscar So Black or what have you. But when you look at like these hashtag campaigns, those to, bring attention and awareness to, what happened to Sandra Bland and folks like Trayvon Martin or what have you, that does create some type of change in a way that is measurable. So I don't think that you can just kind of throw it out. But having said that, as academics, as scholars, as media makers, we know that knowledge production and dissemination are integral mechanisms of social change. So we integrate the work that we're hired to do as faculty, and we make sure that it's work that helps change the world. And this can occur on a campus or in many other places. My teaching philosophy, and I put this up here for you because I think for me, my teaching philosophy dovetails into the social activism and scholar activism that I do in the community. So quote that I love is a little knowledge that acts is worth infinitely more than much knowledge that is idle. And of course, that's the prophet, the philosopher Khalil Gibran. I fundamentally believe this to be true. I've been saying this since I became a member of the academy more than 20 years ago. Can't believe it's been 20 years, but it has. And so, what's the point of studying these topics that are important? And as is the case with most of us on this particular workshop discussion, we work on intersectionality, issues of race, class, gender, sexuality. We study media, we study populations, we study the intersection of media with these populations. So, kind of like what is the point of doing that kind of work and having that level of intellectual curiosity and coming to some really good solutions and not sharing them with the communities that we serve and study. And we're also a part of those communities. So, anyone who has had any type of exposure to hegemony, which is a theoretical term that talks about power and the fluidity of power and how it shifts and takes shapes in different forms, even if you are in an academic institution and you may be part of a disenfranchised group, even within that space. At times there are ways that you can shift power. There are ways that you can make contributions. There are ways that you can use that power to improve your community. And so, in my mind, knowledge and society are inextricably linked with each other, informing and shaping one another. So, when I'm teaching, I apply a paradigm of learning because I know that when I was talking to Dr. Cooper, she wanted to be sure that we were like really thinking about this topic in a way that's pragmatic. So when I think about a paradigm of learning, I think about history, theory, and practice, and I would add criticism. But that is one of the ways in which you can like concretely engage the material and share it, right? And all of my syllabi, it's completely identified. The goal of each one of my classes is to make sure that knowledge is not only gained, but moves throughout the classroom and eventually to the community. And my approach to teaching and scholarships involves the public. So how can one study media industries and the culture and not engage the public? So, historically, there's been this whole idea that, if you're going to do serious scholarship, you have to be removed from your subjects, right? Or you're removed from the communities in which you're studying. But the reality is, when you are part of cultural groups that are collective, not only in our identity, but also in our practices and in some of our intellectual philosophies, then it's very hard to do that. And so it's a constant fight, but it's an important one. And I think it's a hill to die on, really, in academia, in that, we don't really remove ourselves from our people. That's just not who we are culturally, and that's diasporically. So, I think that's a good point of conversation eventually when you think about this topic. What my scholar activism looks like, I have the Burton Wire, which is an award-winning news blog that covers news of the African diaspora. I founded that because in my work as a scholar and as a practitioner, I found that there needed to be more attention paid to African populations outside of the US. So, I focus a lot on the US. And even in my public intellectual work, I talk a lot about the US, but I also think about the global African diaspora and the things that are happening there. And as a way of disseminating information we have and is bringing the information from them back to us as well. WEEN, which is a Women in Entertainment Empowerment Network, it's an organization, it's a nonprofit, a group of dynamic Black women work with young Black girls who are interested in careers in entertainment. I designed their curriculum for them. So, they contacted me. I knew a couple of the folks who were founding this organization. They're over a decade old. And when they told me what they were doing and asked if I could help, I did. I helped design their curriculum for them. Volunteer mentorship. I volunteer now with many organizations, some civic organizations, my sorority, but I also do volunteership for organizations that I'm not a part of. So, for example, I mentor young girls who are interested in careers in media for Jack and Jill of the southern region of Jack and Jill of America. So, even if you're not part of an organization, doesn't mean you can't help them move along. And I've worked a lot with the Urban League as well. Strategic organizational membership, that's something that you can actually think about. when you are thinking about the organizations you're in. Beretta and I are in SCMS. She's a past chair of the Black Caucus. I'm the current chair of the Black Caucus, second time being the chair of the Black Caucus. And so we work in those organizations along with a lot of other dynamic people who are committed to making sure that our scholarship becomes activism in shaping the academy and shaping these programs that we're part of. And then, of course, the public intellectualism. I work as a commentator a lot. I do a lot of broadcasts. I write a lot. I edit, and I choose to work with the Black press. Currently, I'm working with Black Press USA to lend my talents to those organizations, which is sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes underfunded and under-resourced. And so that's a choice that I make because that is my area of expertise, and that's where I want to give those talents that I develop in the academy. So what can you do? And then I'm going to hand this off to Tina. These are just some suggestions I have. So take them or leave them. And if you want to reach me, you can reach me at Emory. I'm on the website. But you can mentor people. Your scholar activism doesn't have to be out in the community necessarily. You can start on campus. There are lots of issues happening on campus. I would encourage you, though, if you are not tenured, to take them up with people who are tenured and who are allies, and let them take that up. And then once you get tenure, to do that, because that's a serious thing, especially as it relates to being people of color scholars on mainstream and on all university campuses. Let's say that you can start a nonprofit. I know that's a major undertaking in some cases, but it doesn't have to be a huge. It doesn't have to be a huge endeavor. It doesn't have to be a huge organization that mirrors a corporation. You can partner with nonprofits or civic-minded organizations. I know Beretta works with the NAACP. I work with the Urban League. Days work with a group around the Black girlhood. Tina's worked with, a myriad of organizations here in the state of Georgia. So, you can partner with nonprofits or civic-minded organizations and volunteer your services to them. And then, of course, you can become a social entrepreneur. I know that's a hot button topic now, but that's basically what Black folks have been doing worldwide for like a couple of thousand years. But now there's a term for it. Everybody's doing it, but that's a way where you use your entrepreneurialism to create change in the world. This is a pretty quick workshop, but I just wanted to put that out there. Hopefully, I have given you something to think about. So without further ado, I will hand off to Tina, who can share her PowerPoint and pick up where I'm leaving off.
All right. Okay, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
No! Okay, try it again.
There we go. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to share with you all today is it's essentially a case study that I did with one of my classes that I think is an exemplar of my perception of social activism or being a scholar activist. I did not know that I was doing this for quite a while. So when as of late, when I have been doing this kind of research, it just reminds me that we can translate theory to practice in very fundamental and impactful ways. So this particular case study actually is a publication that I have with a couple of graduate students, but I think that this version of the interpretation of those findings is critical because it helps us to demonstrate that there are multiple pedagogical strategies that we can use to move theory into practice and ultimately address different types of systemic oppression. And one of my passions is addressing the issue of race in the classroom. And in this particular instance, we're talking about the movie Dear White People. Even though it was released, I think maybe in 2017, I think that it still is powerful in its role to empower students in the classroom, to indicate that, or to demonstrate to them, that yes, you're taking this course for credit, but the activities, the assignments, and the other aspects of this course are really providing you with tools necessary for, in my view, for dismantling racism as a form of systemic oppression. So I believe that film in the classroom achieves several goals. This is just a few of them, and there are many more. They the film itself has an influence on the rhetor standpoint. So that means that the students are rhetoricians. They're using their discourse to address these issues both within and outside of the classroom. Film can educate students about the realities of racism, and film can also illustrate the film's role in facilitating self-reflexive analysis. And so in other words, students are exposed to film, and it pushes them in ways that can be perceived as uncomfortable, and for others it can be very liberating. So I envision the classroom as being not just a classroom, but it also affords the students with an opportunity for cultural critique. And in this instance, we're talking about the use of visual text or film, and it serves as an objective artifact whose function is to engage students in the process of learning about race, race relations, and interracial communication. I mean, there are other subjects that they can learn about, but when I was at the University of Georgia for 21 years, I taught interracial communication for, I think, at least 18 years. And good Lord, that's a long time. But anyway, that class gave me an opportunity to integrate my favorite movies into the classroom, and then providing students with that space to talk about these very important issues. So I take the position that visual text is non-intimate, so students aren't really wedded to it. I mean, they're wedded to it in that they're invested, but they don't necessarily have to tell their own personal stories, because that might be uncomfortable for some of them. It creates emotional and cognitive distance between self and artifact. And it also, and I know we've used this term quite a bit in general, but it does provide a safe space and a site for class discussion. So, students can use we use the movie, any movie for that matter, as a point of reference, and that takes away the pressure of talking about race issues as they impact the student. I don't want to do that all the time, so I integrate film into the classroom in that way. I specifically am an advocate of critical race pedagogy. Not only do I do research on it, but it's the way I, treat my classroom, or approach my classroom rather. And so this statement, I think, captures my stance on this. So the focus of my research is on the ways in which race and racism shape what happens in the classroom. And teachers, as they help students develop not only a racial consciousness, but become full participants in the struggle to end racism on multiple fronts. So it's not just for course credit, but I believe that I challenge my students to think critically about what they can be doing, with this knowledge in real world context. Well, I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on the history of dear white people, but I chose to. I'm sorry, the movie came out in 2014, not 2017. Dang, that's a long time ago. Anyway, the film I wanted to use because it takes place on a fictional campus. The school is a predominantly white institution, and that's what I happen to teach at, both when I collected this data from my students and currently. And I think that we can definitely use these spaces to make some serious inroads when it comes to racism. So I wanted to choose that. I chose that movie because it is a mirror of what I think is happening on a lot of predominantly white institutions on those campuses, and it would also make the film a little bit more relatable for the students. So just to kind of give you a very brief background on how I conducted the study, I had students write reaction papers to the film, and it was a part of the course assignment. And I told them that their participation was totally, voluntary, and if they didn't want me to use it, that I was totally okay with that. But I did not want them to feel any kind of pressure. And I think most of the students did give me permission. And so these two other graduate students assisted me with analyzing analyzing the data, which was the reaction papers, and it was very fruitful because it generated a lot of themes. But I'm just going to focus on 5 emergent themes, and just so you all are aware, there were a total of, I think, 88 sub themes that fell into one of those different categories. And so the first one was theory to practice. And so this was where the students demonstrated that they learned terms in class and they accurately applied them to the images and the narratives that were present in the film. And then there was introspection, where students were able to identify content in the film that made them start to engage in self-reflection and self-awareness. Cultural critique it refers to the degree to which real-world issues regarding race are mirrored in the film. There's also cinematic critique, and so this is where students offered an evaluation of the film as a tool for addressing issues related to institutional racism. And lastly, we have neologism, and there were only five instances of this, but I thought it was still important for us to recognize. And this is self-generated terms from students that were used to label their experiences with film viewing. So I have two quotes that I want to share that illustrate the impact that these courses can have on social activism. So this is a white male, and he stated that, as I previously stated, I think if we as college students challenge ourselves to all have the discussions when a race issue pops up, then we would really see some positive changes come out of it. That is something I think the film showed me. We all need to do as good of a job as those in the film did, trying to tackle race issues head on. And a white female says, I think awareness and empathy are two things that all college campuses need. Classes about, and this is verbatim, so if there's some grammatical errors, it's as is. I'll start over. I think awareness and empathy are two things that all college campuses need classes about, because these two things allow people to not necessarily identify completely, but at least no one is ignorant about another person's story of feelings. Even seeing that this film could be produced and shown in a movie theater brings me great comfort, because 40 years ago, this would not had even been possible to film. The road to true racial equality is a difficult and long one, and films like these help us to reach the point where we are comfortable with everyone. So my concluding thoughts are that films about racism contribute to appropriate and necessary discussions about race relations. The interracial communications class specifically helps students develop not only a racial consciousness, but it really challenges them to become full participants in the struggle to end racism on multiple fronts. And the last point is that interracial communication fosters social justice through knowledge, information, and critical thinking and interpersonal skills necessary for deconstructing institutional racism and reducing racial microaggressions. I do want to quickly note that I have another case study that involved student reactions to not film, but to observations or interracial encounters that occurred in real life. They had to reflect on them. It was a course assignment, and again, I got their consent to use their papers for the purpose of publishing and just to better understand how to translate theory to practice. And what I found was that there are 4 stages, and I don't have them included in the slide, but there are in the slideshow, but there are 4 stages that I found students tend to go through when it comes to identifying race and then confronting race. And oftentimes they do feel comfortable once they have taken the class, because they have the skills and the knowledge to confront family and friends and maybe even strangers, but in a productive way. And excuse me, that piece along with this one, I think really does hit home the importance of the scholarship that we engage in. So as I mentioned earlier, we had 5 general clusters of themes, and there were 88 subclusters that emerged as evidence of student critical thinking while watching a race themed film. Race and gender directly shaped understandings and perceptions of various race issues within the film. While there were some students who felt that the movie Dear White People exaggerated race issues, for the most part, most of the students felt that it was accurate, and sometimes they felt it was discouraging, and then others felt that it was empowering because it gave voice to myriad of issues related to race. So white males experienced less white guilt, more self-reflection, and that was greater than white women. And then the last point was that some students felt like there was exaggeration and realism, in the movie, And I think for those who felt it was exaggerated, from what I remember, they were white and just didn't think that it was possible that all of this could be happening at one time. But their Black classmates, we know, were able to speak to the realism of the film and its ability to depict institutionalized racism within the context of the university. And so while we might think that these experiences are diametrically opposed to each other, it's important for us to recognize their value in terms of students learning from each other and ultimately being empowered to address these issues within and outside of the classroom. Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. And of course, now we will have Professor Rogers, filmmaker extraordinaire and scholar.
Okay, as soon as I can find a little prompt for me to stop sharing, I'll do that. Okay, my screen's not letting me see how I can do that. So, Dr. Burton, can you, never mind, I see it. There we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I am Dehanza Rogers, MFA, not doctor. I'm in the Department of Film and Media at Emory University. And before we start, I want to do a land acknowledgement. We are at Emory University, and I am in Atlanta, and I wanted to acknowledge that we're on traditional land of the Muskogee Creek people, past and present. And it's important to honor not only the land, but the people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. And I implore you to research some of the history of Muskogee peoples in Georgia, specifically the Black, Indigenous, and Afro-Indigenous experience, as well as Native peoples within your area. So I want to talk about my guiding principles. Paulo Freire said, reading the world always precedes reading the word, and reading the word implies continually reading the world. As a professor and as an artist, I try to integrate the work of the classroom with that of the world around me, as well as mentoring students and community members and nurturing Black expressive cultural traditions, as well as challenging one-dimensional narratives that denigrate and speak down to Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and create anti-racist curricula and creative work. So in my classroom, like Dr. Harris mentioned, bringing race into the classroom. So I teach classes that are about practice, as well as a class that's about theory and deconstruction of media. So one of my practice courses is cinematography, which is the art of filming, photographing films, of storytelling, right? And in that class, we talk about skin tone and race and how lighting affects the skin tone of various people. There are cinematographers who are wonderful at lighting dark skin, lighting light skin, lighting brown skin. And then there are cinematographers who are horrible at it. And I teach my students what it means to be a cinematographer and meet that challenge, where if you are a cinematographer, the amount of light you use on dark skin is going to be different than white skin. And that light needs to be sculpted. It's just not about shooting a lot of light to a darker skin, but also giving it the same care that you would give white skin, right? Photographing Black skin lovingly is a political act. And I teach my students that. And then I teach a class on narrative filmmaking. And in that class, we talk about researching our stories. And part of that is, I want you, white or Black student, brown student, to talk about what's going on in the world, right? I give them a constraint. You have to talk about, write a story around something that's happening in the world in the last 6 months. While I want them to find their voice, they need to find their voice within that constraint, within what's going on in the world. It's not enough to say, I've made something. How do you read the world in order to proceed reading the word, right? And that's what's really important. The work that I create in terms of my curriculum, again, it's about anti-racism, right? It's about addressing and anti-gender issues, right? Where if we are talking about creating women characters, not falling into tropes. If we're talking about creating brown and Black people, not falling into tropes. There is a difference between your character being racist and you being racist, and you need to know that difference, right? So in the classroom, you have to create relevant courses that deconstruct and challenge dominant narratives. So the class I'm teaching now, it's the first time I'm teaching it at Emory. I taught it at my previous institution. It's called Viewing Black Girlhood. And this is the synopsis. Viewing Black Girlhood exists, the popularity of Black girl magic, the consumption of Black girl women film culture and style, and the limited number of Black girlhood narratives affirms the need to view Black girlhood. So the rest of it you can read really quickly, but the purpose of the course is to watch films where Black girls are the protagonist. Either it's a television show or it's a film. And we deconstruct what that Black girl narrative is, who is telling that story, right? And then we talk about how we use I had a student ask, are we going to watch anything that's joyful? Well, that's the question. You know, the narratives that are being told about Black girlhood is about Black trauma, right? You know, there are very few stories that are talking about Black love for girls, right? About Black beauty and joy for girls. And we look at, you know, critical race theory, we look at, you know, complex theoretical work, and we marry that with the film. If we're watching Crooklyn, for instance, we're reading Bell Hooks's piece on Black death pertaining to Crooklyn. Right? If we're talking about Black femmes, or for instance, Gun Hill Road, which we'll watch next week, the students are looking at, you know, film culture, right? A teenager who's going through transition, as well as being a brown, you know, Latinx person, being Afro-Latinx and what that means, that identity, our identity around our hair, colorism, all these different topics we're talking about. And Dr. Burton mentioned, you know, social media as activism. We talked about Black girlhood and protest, and we watched The Hate U Give. And then we talked about how Black teenage girls, as young as 14 years old, were leading protests during the George Floyd Black Lives Matter protests. And they used social media to connect with each other and to find each other and to go out and protest when they've never actually been to a protest before. So that's what we talk about in the class. And hopefully, you know, these young women go out into the world and remember these stories about Black girlhood. They themselves were Black girls once, and they're still kind of on the cusp, right? I now have a Latinx young man in the course. Usually it's Black women. And I love the fact that he wants to also understand what it means to be a Black girl. So again, it's about creating relevant courses and bringing those topics to your students, and then they go out into the world and then impart that knowledge. So my scholar artist activism, because I am also an artist, I am a filmmaker. My space is the classroom as well as the community. Mentoring, which is storytelling workshops, filmmaking workshops, mentoring students at other universities who want to talk about filmmaking and storytelling. The same what Dr. Burton mentioned in terms of strategic organizational membership, creating media, right? I have a podcast called Color Creating the Narrative, where we talk about different films that eliminate or erase people of color in the space and time that those films exist, right? If the film exists, you know, during World War II, there were Black and brown people in World War II. You can't exclude the fact that they were also on the front lines, but these narratives do that. So we deconstruct those narratives and talk about the actual time period. Films that I've created, hashtag Black Girlhood, which is about Black girlhood and what Black girls go through in terms of adultification, the school to prison pipeline, and then a film called From Land to Land, which is about immigration. So From Land to Land is a part of the quote that's on the Statue of Liberty, right? It's about opening our arms and, you know, people coming here and coming from land to one land, right? And then public scholarship, imparting the knowledge that you have onto the world in public spaces. To go back to what Dr. Harris was speaking on in terms of students being, you know, leading discussions. Part of the Viewing Black Girlhood is they have a film that they have to deconstruct and then lead a conversation and then find texts that actually break down and deconstruct those ideas. It's not just about, hey, give me a summary of the film. It is about, I want you to analyze the themes in the film. And that's, you know, once again, the classroom and where you do those things. And that's it. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Nice job. Thank you, Dehanza. And if you don't know Dehanza's films, you should. They are amazing. She's an amazing filmmaker.
Absolutely.
And I don't say that because we worked together. I knew who she was before. And that actually means something coming from me. I'm just kidding. But yes, she's an amazing filmmaker. Watch her films and hire her. Okay, there we go. All right, Dr. Beretta Smith-Shomade is going to bring it home for us.
And I'm bringing it home without a PowerPoint. When I was like, oh man. So I really I'm just really talking about what it is that I do and how I kind of think about scholar activism. So my focus, and when I think about what my scholar activism is K through 12 media literacy. And I wanted to start with kind of talking about what that actually is. Now, so all of us, I think, do media literacy at the university setting, but media literacy in terms of the term itself really does refer to the K through 12 educational piece. And it includes the criticality of thought and experience, but it's also about creating. So it's about video production and photography and writing and thinking about the ways that young people can know what's going on and also then produce, one, to see the difficulties of production, but also to talk about where their voices and where their narratives can be told from a different perspectives. So, and while media literacy, K through 12 media literacy is important and mandatory in several European countries and Canada, it has very little traction here in the United States. And it has really still been, even though people have been doing this stuff 30 years now, it's still kind of defined to individual teachers, individual departments, some schools, and some more outside organizations. So we talk about something that is so critical to our, if we want to be really kind of basic, our GMP, our US GMP, but really does get short shrift because there's a reason why the larger kind of studies not all that interested in us really understanding what it is that we see and screen and listen to. So that's kind of what media literacy is. And so my background is I started teaching K through 12 media literacy when I was a visiting scholar at the University of Houston in African American studies. And it really wasn't about what I was teaching there because I was teaching a class on Spike, but it was just because that was interesting to me. There was an organization called Writers in the Schools where they partner with young people, elementary and middle school and high school, to teach about creative writing. Creative writing is not my strong suit, but I said, well, I know media, can I do that? And they were like, come on and do it. And so that was my first media literacy foray. And I created this curriculum, and I was twice a week for the entire year teaching two cohorts of sixth graders. My sixth graders who are now married and graduating, getting their PhDs and all this kind of stuff. And you're like, what in the world? But that's where I started. And I went in there and I taught them all of things that, that we had learned, that I was teaching already, that I had learned in grad school, and thinking about how do I get these young people to bring it up? How do I get them to embrace it? So we created projects. We did stuff around advertisements and what narrative means and all of these different things. And so I was so excited about how it went. When I returned to my institution at the time, which was the University of Arizona, I created a class for graduate students that would then turn around and go into sixth grade classrooms and teach. And it started off as a 1 semester and then became this 2 semester course. So for the better part of 18 years, I've taught hundreds of sixth graders and grad students and undergrads, because it became an undergraduate classes in Tucson, New Orleans, and now in Atlanta. So that my kind of negotiation with having young people understand media literacy has been the activism that I've had. Now, how that has impacted my scholarship, and I don't advise what I'm about to say for anybody on tenure track, but my activism has always been part and parcel of who I am and how I was raised, and has not as well translated into my scholarship. My scholarship it is on the confluence of television and digital media to some extent, with gender and race, African Americans primarily, sexuality, and certainly the wages of class. And my publications center those areas. That's kind of where I have stayed published for the most part. And my sixth graders, they get to be a part of that, or when I teach my students to teach sixth graders, because when we're talking about something like what advertisements do or who they sell to, we're talking about demographics, we're talking about target audience, but we're also talking about who gets talked to and who doesn't, what products get sold to a certain demographic of people and what don't. So I might bring in something like Spike Lee's Bamboozled example, when they're, and it is Bamboozled, right? Where they're selling the bottle of liquor, and it's talking about what that means, and what that particular advertisement or that particular sale, why that goes to that audience as opposed to a different audience. We might be talking about something about gender in the advertisements that come up with girls, and Black girls in particular, but girls in general, how we get sold to, or are used to sell other products. The Super Bowl being a really good place to sell products via women's bodies, or and we also talk about stories and how stories get articulated in different ways. And so for the most part of my career, these have been separate, but I've tried to more recently try to bring them more together, successfully and not so successfully, because really I think, and again, as I said, I don't advise this for people in the academy, especially if you're tenure track, that it's good to marry those things. If you can teach classes that you're doing your research on, and that that you do outside of, that's a good thing to do. But I've always thought of it as something, it's my kind of personal thing that I enjoy doing. So beyond the media literacy classes that I teach, I also take up this part as my work, my sorority Delta Sigma Theta. Have done workshops for the programs that we have where we are addressing young girls, middle school girls, elementary school girls. So I'll do workshops for them, and I'll have them doing media literacy stuff, as Dehanza I think spoke to with both Nsenga and Dehanza spoke to, about doing things with organizations like the NAACP. So they have an AXO program. So Dehanza is mentoring for that, and I do stuff around that I can bring my skills in, which may not be directly related to what it is that I do, but it's still asking them to think through media in a particular kind of way. As Nsenga said, active with the SEMS, both in terms of the Black Caucus, but also because what we used to do, and we haven't done in a long time, is we would go, whatever city we were in, we would partner with a high school, and the scholars who were interested, go to that high school and have some kind of media literacy workshop, series of workshops. And we haven't done that in a while. And part of that, I mean, quite honestly, a part of why it hasn't been done in a while is because that activity then became concretized in the organization and taken over by some other folks who were not necessarily interested in that per se. What they did was something else that probably wasn't as useful as what we were doing. And so asking students, I try to, in media, K through 12 media literacy, make it relevant, make it viable. Going back to something Dehanza said about the people that you use, whether it's Paolo Freire, which I stay using, Bell Hooks teaching to transgress. I use Paolo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and we're reading all of these texts for them to understand that this is something that you're trying to be transformative of the people that you're talking to, but also you have to allow them to transform you. So when I'm teaching in my classes, or I have my students teach, you always have to ask, what are y'all watching? What are you screening? What are you listening to? And make that a part of what it is that gets articulated back to them. I'm always going to take up their suggestions for readings and screenings and things, because one, it makes them feel a part of what is happening, because I'm always talking about the teaching and learning flow, but also because it allows you as a scholar to broaden out your perspective. We kind of get narrow focus. And I know I'm a kid of I stay 70s, 80s, and early 90s. That's just kind of where my headspace is all the time. And so even when I'm giving references, I'm like, oh, y'all don't know anything about that. You weren't even born. So I have to then go back and modify. But if they tell me I'm watching, what's the last thing? I think I watched Emily in Paris, which is, it's a really kind of crazy show, and I don't understand why it's nominated for anything, but it is something that I have to bring up because they're watching it, and I have to figure out how to talk about that in a space. So my scholar activism is both being privy to what is going on, to make sure that I'm constantly talking about the isms of our lives and how they matter, and also taking that out in the streets consistently. And trying to make sure that's a part of my scholarship as well. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Well, This has been a wonderful, fruitful conversation. I definitely think it is a workshop because there was lots of good information given. We were going to have a discussion following it, but we're really close to the edge. So we're going to do a hard stop at 45 minutes. But I just wanted to kind of wrap up just this idea of working with students, scholars, activism looks like many different things. And there are many different ways you can do it, whether it's on campus, in the classroom, out in the actual community, in the blogosphere, at your church, with your sorority, what have you. There are different ways of giving back and being a scholar activist. And I think that's part of it too, which I want to say concretely, and this is what I got from all of your presentations, is that it's also a form or a way of us contributing and giving to our communities. And so it's more than just creating change, but it's also a way for us to feel fortified and to be part of this larger diasporic collective sharing that we do that is really indigenous, is part of who we are as indigenous Afro-Latina and people of African descent worldwide. So we thank you for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat wherever this is screened. And of course, you know how to reach all of us because you know where we all are. But thank you for joining us, and we wish you safe travels, stay healthy, wear a mask, all of those things that we need to do so that Black people can continue to be prosperous and continue to thrive in this society. Thank you.